So real quick, how do we get here, right? So really fundamentally, imagination. Where do these sort of ideas come from? But at the same time, when we're talking to students, the very important thing is we try and impart knowledge. And the problem with knowledge is a box. And as long as if we taught you everything that could be known, then there still wouldn't be anything new that would come out of that. And that's just not the way things should be. As people, we're creative. We want to create new things, to create new opportunities, and to do things with, hey, this device does this thing, but if I put it with this thing, then it does something completely different. And that's where we really want to go. And Einstein understood this completely. The guy was brilliant not just about particle physics. I mean, the man was brilliant about leadership and about what we need to do as far as creativity and imagination. So it's imagination versus knowledge. Okay, so one of the things that we have, one of the things that we get taught as engineers, assumptions and concepts. If you have an assumption or a requirement, that quite literally becomes the box in which your idea has to exist. When people talk about thinking outside the box, you have to go back and question those requirements that you put together originally. And sometimes you discover that something you thought was a requirement really isn't a requirement at all. It's an artificial thing that you imposed on yourself. And it turns out that that wall doesn't exist. And so when people, and I never knew this until I actually got to this point, right? People never told me that thinking outside the box, okay, is simply a question of knowing which side of that wall you need to be in, and whether you can think about, if that's not really a requirement, you can do those things. Now, once you do those things, now here's the key. Knowing which rule to break is the really important part. Because sometimes it's okay to break that rule, sometimes it's not. You have to know when you can do those things. Okay, but here's the problem. Once you create a solution, once you create an idea, right? We carry those things, you can see that in your mind. When I talk about people landing on the moon, okay, when I was your age, younger than you guys are actually, people walked on the moon. I saw it live, all right? It was that exciting. It was incredible to see that there were 12 people who walked on the moon. You ever get that opportunity to go hear one of those guys? You must go do it. Hands down, no question. There's only 8 of them left. There were 12. There are only 8 of them left. You know what I'm saying? Okay. You need to go do this. Even just the guys who went to the moon, that's just so amazing that we had the audacity to do that. Now, we think going to Mars is going to be the same thing. Not at all. Can't do it. Can't do it the same way at all. It turns out it's 100 times as long to get there, and it's 1,000 times as far. You can't do it the same way. Somebody's going to have to solve that problem. And I can guarantee you it's not going to be guys that look like me. It's going to be guys that look like you that are going to figure this out. All right? So, requirements, assumptions, concepts, and ideas. By the way, once you see that idea, you put it in your tool bag. And they call that experience, right? That's why places that employ us keep guys that look like me around, even though we're dead weight baggage. All right? Seriously, they talk about experience. Oh yeah, we solved this problem once before. Hang on a sec. And you pull that out. And that's not what we're looking for. We're going, well, why did you do that? That was dumb. You didn't need to do this part. That's what we're looking for. How to solve those problems differently. Okay, so one of the things I want to talk about, there's an atmosphere on Mars. We already talked just a couple weeks ago, right? There's water on Mars, liquid water on Mars. So you have an atmosphere, you have water. Okay, if you have an atmosphere and water on Mars, then you can fly an airplane there. One of the things we don't talk about a whole heck of a lot is if you have water on Mars and if you have an atmosphere on Mars, by the way, those are 2 products that are rocket exhaust. If you have rocket exhaust on Mars, adding energy to it You can break that back down, turn it back into rocket fuel. When the astronauts leave, and this is not talked about very much either, and I've been really surprised about this, when they leave from the moon to go to Mars, we're not leaving from Earth, we're leaving from the moon to go to Mars. Okay? When they leave from the moon to go to Mars, the amount of fuel that they're going to have on board to come back from Mars is 0. They're going to manufacture all their rocket fuel on Mars. By the way, nobody's invented that machine to do that yet. We know how to do it. We can do it in a lab, but nobody's done that yet. Again, the people who solve that problem that's not me. That's going to be you guys. All of you guys. Okay. So, you have an atmosphere. You could potentially make an airplane that could fly on Mars. Now, there have been people who've been captivated by this idea since the 1970s. I knew some of those people when I was an intern at NASA. And that was 35 years ago, all right? And those guys are gone now. But, and there have been 9 proposals to fly an airplane on Mars. I've been on 8 of them. We still haven't flown an airplane on Mars. I want this to happen so bad. You have no idea. This excites me. Okay. One of the other problems I've been working on for an incredibly long time, flying wings. This was a problem that I set out to solve. And it was done in my spare time. And a really close buddy of mine, he was a professor at a university, and he used to come and visit for the summer. And he gave me all this information. He said, you know, flying wings, they look just so simple, but they're really hard to fly. They don't handle well, and why is that? You look at this thing and you go, this should be awesome. And it doesn't work. It doesn't work for the pilot very well. Why is that? What are we missing? There's something fundamental here that we are missing. Well, so one of the ways you solve this problem is you put a tail on a flying wing. So it's not a flying wing anymore, right? Where does that come from? It comes from these two guys, Wilbur and Orville Wright. Turns out their first 3 solutions to the problem, they didn't have a tail on their airplane on the back. They weren't trying to steer with the rudder. They did not solve the problem that way. This actually was the thing they had missed. When they would bank their airplane, they would create more lift. This was their key. I can prove this to you. Watch. They would bank the airplane in order to turn. But when you create more lift, you create more drag. So they would bank, but the airplane would slice the wrong way, and then it would crash into the ground. And this glider right here, their 1901 glider, they flew hundreds of times. And Wilbur was so frustrated at the end of that flying season, he said, man would not fly for 50 years. But he went back, they did a bunch of wind tunnel tests, and in 1902 they came back with an airplane, a glider that had a vertical tail. They solved this problem. Their entire flying season that year was 2 weeks, 14 days. That was it. And at the end of that 14 days, they were done, they were ready. Because the next time they came back to Kitty Hawk, the following year, 1903, and they flew their airplane for the first time. But when they went back in 1906 to patent their idea, right here, you'll notice there's no engine, there are no propellers. They patented their glider. And the reason they patented their glider as the airplane, it was all about the control. Now they had a device on the back. When they would bank their airplane, they would turn that rudder, and they could control yaw. Guess what? We still solve that problem the same way today. Airplanes have some direct method of controlling yaw on them. Even the B-2, even though it doesn't have a rudder. I'll show you that later on. So flying wings appear to not be possible. Why is that? So this guy, Ludwig PRANDTL, brilliant man, should have won the Nobel Prize for physics because of his contributions to aeronautics. He figured out the tool, and his tool was called the lifting line. His tool predicted the performance of wings. It was the first time anybody could predict what the wing would fly like before you actually built it. You could do this with math, okay? It was brilliant what he did. And he did that in 1918. And he had 4 really brilliant students working for him at that time who carried on his work after he retired from being a professor. But one of the things he discovered, once you have a tool, you can do optimization. You can find out what's the minimum drag for this wing. And when you do that, by the way, you end up with an ellipse. Right here, right across that. So, this is the standard theory. But there's 2 ways of measuring the size of a wing. And this was the one way. Everybody thought about the wingspan. Remember that box? So that's one requirement. What's the wingspan? You have to optimize for the wingspan. But here's the funny thing. Somewhere along the way, somebody forgot. Oh, sometimes you can actually see this on airplanes. See the ellipse over the wing from one wingtip to the other? Now watch what happens here, okay? You get wingtip vortices. And his theory predicts this also. These things are wingtip vortices streaming off the wing, and they're leaving energy in the air behind the wing. And this is drag. Sometimes you can see both. Very rare. Okay, this is the standard theory. This is what everybody does. When you get to university, they're going to teach you this. And it's not that they're wrong, but there is an alternative. And that alternative looks like this. And you see these every day, and the amazing thing is, if you try and find out in the scientific literature how these animals turn without a vertical tail, you will not find that paper. That paper does not exist. Now, if you could solve the flying wing problem, possibly you would solve this problem. Let me tell you a story. Right here, notice, see that joint right there? That joint right there is a knuckle. All right? So, when you have a knuckle, those are fingers outboard of that point. And in fact, from here on out, that's a feather, right? So let's stop and think about a feather for a minute, okay? How much load can you carry on the end of a feather? Nothing, all right? I just got done telling you that you should have an ellipse that goes on there. So that means like 20 to 30% of the weight of the bird should rest on this feather. That doesn't happen. Birds don't do that. This animal, wandering albatross, flies around the world 5 times every year when it leaves its nest. And then it comes back every year. And then it goes and does this. By the way, the oldest living bird in the wild right now is an albatross. Her name is Wisdom. She's 63 years old. Okay? 5 times around the world every year. Stop and think about that. Carrying 20% of her weight on her fingers. Doesn't make sense. Doesn't work. So, remember that guy, PRANDTL? He wondered about this problem. And he looks at this and he goes, that can't be right. What if we measured the wing in a different way? Instead of just the wingspan, what if we measured the weight of the wing? Let's hold the weight of the wing and not constrain the wingspan. Now what happens? Here's our old friend, the ellipse, right? See it right here? Curve A. And it stops right here. But if you make it the same weight, exact same weight, not 1 ounce more for structure, okay? And you get the same lift, what's the minimum drag solution? And it looks like this. And this is curve C. It goes all the way out here and goes to 0 at the tip. You notice how it tapers to nothing at the tip? It tapers to nothing at the tip. And all of a sudden you can carry that load on your tip because you don't have any load. But there's something funny about the drag, and the thing that causes that vortex at the tip is called downwash, all right? Here's the elliptical downwash. It's straight, and then you step off the curve, and there's a downwash right here, and it causes a vortex, all right? But here's what happens when you use the other curve, the curve C. It's this long sweeping curve that's down, crosses over, and then it becomes upwash at the tip. In other words, it's not drag at the tip, it's thrust at the tip. Now, if it's thrust at the tip and you create more lift, you create more thrust. And you roll and you yaw the correct direction, and you don't need a vertical tail. Now, the guy who came up with this idea, this paper was written in 1933. The man's name is Ludwig PRANDTL, the most brilliant man on the planet in this area. And he missed that last part. He never made that connection that there would be thrust there on the wingtips. And this paper laid there until 2007. And then I read the paper. Now, I want you to understand, PRANDTL is up here, okay? I'm way down here on the floor. Okay? I am not that smart a guy. Believe me. Sometimes it's just making the right connection. Anybody can make the right connection. All right. So, there were two other guys that stumbled into this exact same thing. Each of them were working on a different piece of the puzzle. Horton figured out that he would have thrust at the tips. He was actually trying to create that with his airplanes. By the way, PRANDTL gave up in 1933. He never did anything with that paper again. Horton gave up in 1950. He never built another airplane again to try and prove this. And by the way, R.T. Jones, Robert T. Jones, who was the chief scientist at a place called the Ames Aeronautical Laboratory up in the San Francisco Bay Area, actually got to meet Dr. Jones, the real Dr. Jones. And he really was impressive. Incredibly smart guy. Incredibly smart guy. He did the exact same thing in 1950, and again, he never did anything with it after that either. And all these papers lay there until 2007. I'm reading all three of these papers, and I go, wait a second, I've heard something like this before. And I was the one that put the pieces together. So here's what happens. I calculated the answer, and I go, that can't be right. I had been trained as a pilot. I knew what the rudder pedals were for. I knew what a rudder was. Adverse yaw is a fact of life. You just can't escape that. And I had an intern working with me at the time, Mike Allen. Mike said, of course it's right. You calculated those numbers. Give me those numbers. And he went away for the weekend and he built this airplane. Guess what? This thing flew exactly like a bird. Exactly like a bird. And this had that exact same curve in it that produces that lift distribution that I showed you earlier. Mike built the very first one. So this is what it looks like. Remember I was talking about the flow off the trailing edge, that downwash? Here it is. Here it's down, and then it crosses over and it becomes up. And if you look carefully right here, look at this, down and up, down and up. In fact, that looks just like it might be a vortex, huh? The vortex wouldn't be at the tip. In fact, if you released the weight, is what we say as an engineer. We've got to have some fancy term for it, right? So we release the weight, then we end up with the vortices. You can see that. Now, if you could actually see this on the airplane, then you might be able to see where the vortices were. The vortices are not at the wingtips. By the way, one of the hardest things to stop doing is saying wingtip vortices. I still say it. So if you catch me, call me on it. Okay? But these are wing vortices. They're not wingtip vortices. But that means there's upwash at the tip and there's thrust out there. And oh, by the way, if birds really did this, then when birds flew in formation, they would fly with those vortices aligned and they would fly with their wingtips overlapped. Okay? Now, you start looking at this stuff and you go, well, maybe there's scientific papers on this stuff. Sure enough, there is. This is Jeff Spedding. The man got his PhD in Bristol, England. He is now a professor of aeronautics down at USC. In fact, unfortunately, I have to lecture to his class this afternoon. So I can't stick around for lunch. So while you guys are enjoying lunch, I'm going to be driving, which might be challenging today, actually. And I have to talk to the class and to their professor who did this data. But it's elliptical. The vortices have to come from the wingtip. So he draws curves on his data in order to try and force the vortices to come from the wingtips. If he'd just drawn straight lines, he would have had the right answer. But he didn't. And by the way, other people have seen this exact same thing with birds. Upwash at the wingtips. Okay? If you take everybody's data that's ever done this, the formation flight of birds and where birds like to fly, 4 different papers, you take all these and you normalize them for the number of samples and for their wingspan and overlay everybody's data, you get these curves. And you can clearly see where the birds like to fly, right here, where this orange column is. All right? And this blue line right here, this blue line is PRANDTL on the inside, and this part out here, my interns and I calculated that. And our data exactly matches what the birds do. Why don't birds have a tip stall problem? This is a really big deal. Everyone always asks me this question. It's like the second or third question out of an aerodynamicist's mind. Because flying wings have this problem. They have a huge problem with tip stall. Why don't birds have a tip stall problem? It's because their lift coefficient goes to 0 at the tip. Oh, by the way, the maximum lift coefficient is in here, about 20 to 30% of the way from the center line. Okay? And so if a bird flew by you very, very slowly, and it was right near stall, then you might be able to see the feathers ruffle at that 20 to 30% of the way out from the tip, because the wing was starting to stall right there for the bird. All these things led us to believe that we had the exact answer that birds have been using all along. They haven't been telling us. So we built the airplane, and we actually got the data and predicted what it should be. That's the black line. That black line was calculated by Mike Allen and I. And then my interns in 2011 and 2012 produced the scatter data here that you see. That almost matches the black line. And that term, by the way, is called CNDA, all right? And that's coefficient of yawing moment due to aileron deflection, CNDA. And we predicted that, and it's come out very, very close. We have, this last summer, we got 58 more points that we've put on this scatter plot, and that was done by, again, my interns. So we've built several different aircraft. We've done, in fact, only 9 aircraft like this have ever been built. The 10th one is being built right now. And 2 of our interns, actually 3 of them, are working on doing an inertia swing on that probably next week. And that will be the 10th airplane that's ever done this. By the way, 10 ever in the history of aviation. And 8 of those came out of our lab. I know the guys who did the other 2. They're buddies of mine too. So, your options. You can either drag a tail around with you all the time, okay, which is the way everybody else does it, or you can manipulate drag at the wingtips to control yaw. See how the B-2 has to fly with its wingtip rudders, those drag things open? Go look at that. Go see if you can find a picture of those closed. There's one, actually, but it was Photoshop. You can tell, because there's another photo of it exactly the same with them open. You're going, and the clouds are exactly the same in the background. You're going, no. Or you can manipulate thrust at the wingtips to control yaw. By the way, I think vertebrate flight has been doing this for a really long time. Pterosaur bones, right? Look at those bones out there at the tip. 128 million years they've been doing the same solution. How much load can you carry on that bone? Nothing. So there's huge efficiency gains. What if you could make this work on Mars? This is very, very stable. It flies very naturally. You're going to see some of that. You're going to hear about some of that later on. We could make this work on Mars. So the mission would be something like this. We're going to go on a large Mars rover, and they always carry a little bit of ballast with them. We want to send CubeSat, a 3U CubeSat, about like this, okay? And inside would be an airplane rolled up. And after it would descend on a parachute, And by the way, you deploy the parachute before you enter the atmosphere. This is a huge innovation that's only just been started experimented with up at NASA Ames, starting in March of this year. They actually deployed a CubeSat from space, off the International Space Station. In fact, that's what that photo is up there, the second one. And that, they put a parachute on there, and the thing came back into the Earth's atmosphere. Didn't burn up, no heat shield. Doesn't need it, uses a parachute instead. It's a brilliant idea. And after you do that, and it's descending on the parachute, then you would deploy this thing from a CubeSat, and it would unroll. You have 2-foot wide airplane. It would weigh 2 pounds in the Martian atmosphere. Here on Earth, it would weigh 2 pounds. In Mars, it only weighs 3/4 of a pound. Different gravity, okay? Very thin atmosphere. It would glide at 6/10 Mach number, about 400 miles an hour for 5 minutes before it would collide with the ground. It would take photos, and if we could get this to deploy over a landing site where the humans are going to land, we could see rocks down to about an inch with the video. I want that to happen. When this thing crashes on Mars, I want there to be a little tiny chip on there with the name of every student that has ever worked on it to go with us. And then finally, sometime later, it would transmit the data and the pictures back. This is our pilot. That's his personality. Trying to get the band back together. These are my interns. These are all the names that I've got so far. This is an advertisement. I want you to come work with me. If you're a student, I want you to come work with me for the summer, okay? We have limited slots, we really do. But I would love to take every student who wanted to come and work on this with us. And it's the most awesome thing to actually go out. And I know you guys sometimes think, you know, you get to hang out with one of the chief scientists at NASA. Yeah, that's true, right? But what happens is I have to run like a crazy man just to keep up with you all summer long. So I don't take summer vacations. Oh, by the way, we pay. You'll hear about that here in a little bit. Come work with us. And by the way, a couple of years ago, the students showed up with cans of paint. That's always a bad thing. They vandalized my parking space. I hope they never change it.
This is clearly all about the aerodynamics, well, much more about just making the wing shape work. Has anyone considered the idea of what it would take to actually put an engine on one of these, or is that not the focus of your research at this time?
Right at the moment, we're not talking about doing an engine. A lot of other people have considered putting engines. The airplanes get very big, very fast. One of the last ones that put an engine on was Ares, that NASA Langley did, and it ended up being bigger than a Cessna. The airplanes get very big, very fast. The idea that we're trying to pursue is do the incredibly simple thing, you know, that a dummy could do, and do that first, and at least get there. Because if you ride along as balanced, that's what we want to do. Good question.
Has there been any research to replicate the atmosphere on Mars to see how the glider would react?
So you'd need a pretty big pressure chamber to do. But, okay, so there's an Avengers movie that starts out inside a huge pressure chamber at NASA Glenn. In fact, the base of the pressure chamber is about twice the size of this room. And that could be done. And I have not thought of that. That's why I have students. What are you doing next summer? You might have to spend your entire 10 weeks next summer at NASA Glenn trying to work with those guys trying to figure this out. I would love to have that happen. That's a great idea. I like that. Somebody write that down. One of my interns, write that down. Okay, how about questions from online?
One that we have online is, where will the landing of the plane be since Mars is rocky?
Yeah, Mars, where will the landing of the airplane be? We're gonna collide with the ground. I mean, there's just, it's 400 miles an hour. I mean, you might be able to slow it down to like 250, but it's gonna be challenging. So we're just gonna overfly the particular landing point and for people, and we're just gonna crash into the ground where we crash into the ground. One of the places we had talked about going was the big Grand Canyon that's on Mars, Valles Marineris, and actually fly down the canyon. It turns out it would take 4 CubeSats to map out that entire canyon this way. We talked about that for a science mission, but it sounds like they've already got that pre-dialed with the water flowing down there. That one of the sites they found the water was actually in the bottom of the canyon.
Someone's asking for more clarification on how the plane will fly in Mars's atmosphere.
So we would design it to do some autonomy, and in fact, you're going to hear a little bit about that. It's actually very, very simple. The airplane is incredibly stable. We would design it for a particular glide point, a design point for cruise, and it would spend most of its time at that same glide point, and it would have very weak guidance. We want to prove that on 3 missions, and we're brainstorming this quite literally. We were putting this together, David Berger, the project manager, and I, and we want to try and get 2 launches off of high-altitude balloons. The first one, it would be already pre-deployed, and just hanging those down, and it would fly away from about 100,000 feet. The second one, we would actually hang it in a CubeSat and deploy it again from the CubeSat at 112,000 feet or so. And that would simulate the atmosphere of Mars. The last one, we actually want to put the CubeSat on a sounding rocket and re-enter the Earth's atmosphere for about 450,000 feet on the end of the parachute and do the entire deployment sequence at about 115,000 feet and have the glider fly back and land at its takeoff point. And all that would be pre-programmed autonomously on the vehicle.